Welcome to the Putback on SNY.TV. I'm Ian Begley here with Chris Williamson, who tips things off with the baseline.
That's right, Ian. Less than a week ago, the Knicks traded for Hawks forward and Zion Williamson connection, Cam Reddish. And with the trade deadline still a few weeks away, could there be any more moves on the way for New York Knicks?
You know, it seems like there has to be because of the rotation, the sheer number of players that could get minutes in this rotation. Then you trade for Cam Reddish, and you would think that the Knicks traded for him wanting to give him minutes. You know, a couple of names that I'm keeping an eye on at the moment: Myles Turner, Jalen Brunson. So many Knick connections between Jalen and the organization because his father, Rick Brunson, played for the Knicks, later coached with Tom Thibodeau. Leon Rose, team president, was Brunson's agent before he came over to the Knicks, and he was also Rick Brunson's agent. I know the Knicks and the Mavs have had contact in the past about Brunson. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Knicks checked in on Brunson ahead of the trade deadline here, because Brunson is entering an offseason where he's an unrestricted free agent. So if Dallas is not willing to pay him, obviously they would want to get something back in return. I'm sure there are going to be conversations around Brunson as we get closer to this February 10th trade deadline.
You know, the thing about Brunson is, in my opinion, at least, he would be a very major upgrade at the position of need for the Knicks. So do you think the trade deadline will be considered a bust or a failure if Leon Rose doesn't acquire a point guard?
I think it depends on how this team is playing, you know, at the deadline and then a few weeks after that, beyond, because prior to the loss against Charlotte on Monday, we had seen a Knicks team that really looked like it was starting to figure things out on both ends of the floor. And that was without Cam Reddish even taking the court. So if they continued to be what we saw earlier in the year, which was so inconsistent and really just not looking like a competitive team in the Eastern Conference, and they don't do anything else at the deadline, yeah, I think you could term it that. I think it just depends on how this season goes with the existing group of players, especially over the next couple of weeks.
This week's guest is Fred Katz of The Athletic, who is in his first year covering the Knicks beat.
I am just so curious to see what is next in terms of how they're going to get him minutes. Is a trade going to pop up to where they're able to clear out more minutes from their rotation? And if not, whose minutes is he going to be taking? Because when you run through the rotation, I mean, you look at all these guys, and there's a similar problem in New York to the one that he faced in Atlanta. It's hard to see a world in which he and Obi Toppin and Quentin Grimes are all playing legitimate minutes. And you know, yeah, you traded a first for Reddish, so you kind of have to play him. But you also used the first on Grimes, who's played very well lately. And you used the first and number 8 pick on Obi Toppin only 14 months ago. So I'm really curious to see how they're going to play out this situation. Yeah,
you're not bringing Reddish in here the way you did for Knox in a first this draft to not play him. So this is a tough wedge for Tom Thibodeau. You know, he's juggled the lineup earlier this season with Kemba Walker starting and then being out of the rotation.
When everybody comes back healthy, you know, Derrick Rose, Kemba Walker, where would you slide Reddish in?
If we're operating under the assumption that like Reddish is going to play at least the same amount of time that he played in Atlanta, which was about 23 minutes, then I think you probably have to give him the backup 4 minutes. Because if you look at the 2 forward spots, I mean, Randall's playing 36. We know Randall is playing 36. We know RJ is playing 33 to 36. So right there, that's 24 to 27 minutes available at the backup forward spots, right? And that is it. They just gave 3 guaranteed years of an expensive contract to Evan Fournier. I struggle to see him playing on average fewer than 25 minutes a game. You've got the point guard minutes. Those backup 4 minutes, maybe Reddish ends up playing as like a small ball 4, which might work terribly because he's not extremely physical. He's not a rebounder. But we're talking about him going up against backup 4s, and maybe he can take mismatches off the dribble and be able to score that way, be able to stretch. Maybe that could work in a bench unit. And then maybe, you know, another 12 or so minutes at the wing where maybe he can play next to Randall and RJ. And maybe that's how you climb to those minutes. But in that scenario, I think it's hard to wedge Quentin Grimes in there. It's hard to wedge Obi Toppin in there.
What we're talking about, Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, is scenarios where Derrick Rose isn't even back yet, because when Rose is back, then that throws another wrench into the rotation. And you talk about Reddish playing the backup 4 and how that might impact things. And to me, that makes the most sense if you don't make another trade here. But because of this logjam, the way we're discussing it, I have to think that the Knicks are going to at least aggressively explore all their options before the trade deadline to see if something makes sense for them where they can send out a couple of players to create an easier pathway for Reddish's minutes.
Time for the Rose Garden, where I give roses to a player on the Knicks squad that hasn't exactly been highlighted the way that they should be, and that would have to be Mitchell Robinson. Here's a guy, Ian, who, over the last 10 games, he's averaging a double-double, 11 points, 10 rebounds. And what I've liked about him, you see his conditioning is getting better. He's attacking the rim more. When he gets those lobs, he's able to finish hard. And he's looked like a dominating presence out there, especially in that Hawks game. He was just all over the place.
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned the conditioning, and I think that's one of the big factors here for Mitchell Robinson, who was rehabbing basically for 6 months coming into training camp. And so he was not in game shape. And now you're starting to see him move the way he moved before he got hurt, before he had that foot issue. And, really before he got hurt, the coaches were saying, wow, we like where Mitchell is now. We see him making strides. But then he had the injury in March of last year. And he dealt with the after effects. But now I think you're starting to see the Robinson of his first 2 seasons and part of last year. And that's a really good thing for Robinson and the Knicks. And it's interesting because they're coming up on a crossroads here with Robinson. He can be an unrestricted free agent this summer, and the Knicks can also sign him to an extension at any point this season. But you would think that if they don't have plans to do so, if they don't have plans to give him another contract, they would look hard at dealing him ahead of the trade deadline or in a sign and trade in the offseason. Adds another wrinkle here for the Knicks and Robinson as you approach the trade deadline.
Well, health dependent. I think Myles Turner makes a lot of sense. And I know somebody else who I'm on with right now reported that the Knicks were interested in Myles Turner. And I understand why. It's not really about the quality of player Turner is, which is obviously he's a very good player, but he's not an all-star caliber player. He's never made an all-defense team, even though he's a very good defender. It's more about the mold of player, the archetype of player that he is, which is actually extremely rare, which is somebody who can defend the rim while also shooting threes well enough to where defenders have to go out and guard him. And I think that's the exact type of center you need next to Julius Randle. I think one of the reasons Randle's shot selection has been swayed away from the rim over these last 2 years is because the Knicks play a rim diving 5 next to him. So he goes to the hoop and Mitchell Robinson's defender is already there. We've seen that many times, or Nerlens Noel's defender is already there. And that's just not something that happens if you have Myles Turner. So I like that fit, but I think there are a lot of interested teams.
The Knicks are going to have to decide, do we want to give up a first-round pick and one of our young players to get it done? And that's not an easy call to make.
If Dallas calls and says, we want this guy, if Portland calls and says, nah, we think this guy's a perfect fit, we will give you a ton, you have to top that offer. It might take 2 firsts or something.
And speaking of Dallas, Fred, Jalen Brunson is somebody who's been linked, to the Knicks possibly coming here, as Ian has reported. So what do you see as far as, his ability to fit into the Knicks roster?
I like Jalen Brunson. I had him on my 6th man of the year ballot last year. If you trade for him, that's not all the way your team, but it's kind of your team, because you're not trading for him if you're not going to pay him. And he's not, I don't know, Ian, you might have a better idea of what his market is going to be this summer. It's certainly going to be well into 8-figure salary. Now you've got money beyond 2022 committed to him, committed to Randle, committed to Fournier. You're obviously planning on re-signing RJ Barrett. So you've kind of got those guys all lined up now. And the question is that good enough?
And even with Turner, I mean, he's going to be free in 2023, I believe. So if that's a route that you go, you do it with some degree of confidence that you would commit to him on his next contract. You're taking away some future flexibility with either of those moves. So it's just an interesting decision that the Knicks decision makers and other decision makers around the league will be faced with. But I do think, Fred, the number 15, 18, somewhere in that neighborhood, I think that's what Brunson will end up getting. Our thanks to Fred Katz from The Athletic for joining us We'll be back next Thursday at noon with a live episode talking all things Knicks and the NBA. For Chris Williamson, I'm Ian, and we'll see you next Thursday, everybody.